I'd like to welcome Nili Shah, the Executive Technical Director at the IASB. And Nili, part of your job is to just look at the overall sort of standard setting process from a staff perspective. And today we have a couple of questions that we'd like to pose to you so that we understand the workings of the IASB a lot better. We particularly want to focus on, what are they currently working on, what's happening next, etc., etc. So we'll get straight into it. But by way of background, that's Nili Shah, Executive Technical Director at the IASB.
Thank you.
So the IASB is always incredibly busy.
Yes.
So if you had to estimate the number of different projects that are currently underway, what would be your best guess of how many projects are underway?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would guess about 30 or so projects, give or take a few, and those are projects that the board is working on, so nothing that IFRIC is working on. So the staff supports both the board and the interpretations committee, but the 30 is about what the board is working on. And those projects range from everything from research projects to maintenance projects to large standard setting projects. We also have a number of projects in what we call our research pipeline, which it's a pipeline of projects that are not yet active. It's something that arose from our 2015 agenda consultation, where we determined that these are projects that are of interest and of priority to our stakeholders, but we just haven't made them active just yet. The intention is to make them active before the next agenda consultation in 2021. So there are about 8 projects in the research pipeline that over the course of the next couple of years will also become active as well. And in fact, 2 of them have just become active in September, our extractives project and our pension benefits project.
Great. So as an average accountant sitting somewhere in the world,
Yep.
what should I do with all of that information? Because it's, it's stuff you folks are busy with,
Yes.
right? I've got my day job. How should I interact with the activities of the project
Yes.
as they are unfolding?
Yes. So a lot of it depends on how much time you have. You can interact for those that have more time on their hands. You can follow everything that we do very closely, from all of the board papers and all of the board meetings that we have on a monthly basis. We have a number of webcasts and other educational materials that are available. So if you're more inclined to focus on IFRS, or if you just are fascinated by the topic, we have plenty of material out there. For others that have, as I understand, or as you mentioned, a day job, what I would suggest is paying close attention to those projects that are going out for consultation or are currently under consultation. So there are a couple of those. The first is financial instruments with characteristics of equity. We issued a discussion paper in June of this year, and the comment period for that project will go through through the early part of January. So we're very much looking to hear feedback from all of our stakeholders and try to make sure that we're incorporating that into the board's future deliberations. We have another consultation document that we expect to come out in December. That's going to be an exposure draft on onerous contracts and the definition of unavoidable costs. So again, that'll come out in December. Expect a 120-day comment period for that. So we'd very much be interested in hearing what people have to say. The other thing I would pay attention to are those projects that have recently been issued, and the effective date is coming up quickly. So we have a number of projects in that regard. We have IFRS 16, which is effective next year. We have IFRS 17, which is effective in 2021. This past year, we issued our new conceptual framework, which for the board and for the implementation or interpretations committee, that's effective immediately. But for preparers, that'll be effective in 2020. To the extent that preparers use IAS 8 and work through the conceptual framework to determine their accounting policies. We also have a couple more projects that will be issuing final documents in the next couple of months. So we have amendments to IFRS 3 on the definition of a business. which will come out in October, and the effective date for that is 2020 with early application permitted. And then we also have a final amendment to the definition of material, which will be coming out in November, and again, effective 2020 with early application permitted. So to the extent that you have limited time, the two things I would pay attention to would be that first bucket of consultation documents where you can share your feedback with the IASB, and of course that second bucket of things that have already been issued that we just need to get implemented before the effective dates.
So on balance, I see on your website you sort of separate the projects into different categories. You have your research, you have your maintenance projects, etc. Could you just give some insight as to the thinking behind separating them out and why each of those streams are important in their own right?
Yeah. So the idea behind having a separate research phase is to make sure that we truly understand the problem at hand before we start more of the extensive standard setting. So being able to do the initial research phase and the outreach to understand the problem, determine whether there are viable solutions out there, to understand the pervasiveness of the problem, and assuming that these are pervasive issues and we are able to specifically identify what the problem is, and there are solutions that might be feasible, then that research project could go into the standard setting phase, at which point we would continue to devote more resources and potentially issue an exposure draft. So at the research stage, you have potentially the issuance of a discussion paper, which would help us as the staff and the board go through and understand better from stakeholders whether they agree with our definition of the problem and whether they've identified other issues. And then with standard setting, we could potentially make more of those actual amendments to the standard.
Super. So some of your projects have been flagged as kind of your focus projects. You've touched on a couple of them.
Yep.
But there's a particular family of projects which you've got under the umbrella of better communication and financial reporting.
Yeah.
Could you just give us some background about what that was about, how did it come to be, and how all of these different elements fit in together towards that objective?
Yep. So better communications and financial reporting, that really is our flagship project. And as you said, there's a number of sub-projects within there. And it arose from our 2015 agenda consultation, where what we heard from users is that they really wanted to see improvements in the presentation and the disclosure of financial reporting. And when you have problems with those areas, they end up spending time unnecessarily, and they end up just having difficulty understanding the financial statements. So within that umbrella of projects, there are 4 areas. The first is primary financial statements. Second is the disclosure initiative. The third is the management commentary project, and the fourth is the taxonomy. Starting with primary financial statements, so that one is focused exclusively on the face of the financial statements, mostly with the focus on the statement of financial performance. A little bit that we're working on with respect to the statement of cash flows and the balance sheet, but primarily with respect to the P&L. And what the board is looking to do is improve the structure and the content of the statement of financial performance. And a couple of things that they're looking at are mandating subtotals on the face of the income statement, providing additional requirements for disaggregation, for disclosure of unusual and infrequent line items, providing additional guidance for things like minimum line items and templates that would also assist preparers in giving users some more comparable information as they review the statement of financial performance. The other piece that the board has been looking into is providing management with the opportunity and the ability to tell their story, so provide entity-specific disclosures. So on the one hand, the subtotals and all these other items that I mentioned, like disaggregation and minimum line items, would focus on structure and comparability. But then on the other hand, we would also have minimum management performance measures, which would provide a little bit of flexibility for management to tell their story. However, what it would do is also require additional disclosures, so that if management determines that there is a non-IFRS measure that would complement the IFRS measure that's on the face of the income statement, it would provide that in a note, but then it would also reconcile to the IFRS subtotal. It would provide disclosures about how management uses that information, how it's useful to investors, how that measure was calculated, so on and so forth. Because what we're hearing from investors is that, yes, this information, this additional entity-specific information is useful, but they want more transparency around that information, and they want it to be identified or located in one place so they can easily get to it. So for the disclosure initiative, that's another one where there are a number of sub-projects within disclosure initiative. I think the most significant piece of that one is the principles of disclosure component, which in 2017 the board issued a discussion paper. That discussion paper, we received quite a bit of feedback, and one of the things that we had heard was that the board needed to better prioritize what are the key areas where basically the stakeholders could get the most bang for the buck, where we're going to get the most improvement for the changes that might be made to the system. And so from that prioritization exercise that the board conducted, it determined that one of the biggest things that it could do is develop guidance for the development and the drafting of disclosure requirements in our standards. And to improve on that, what has happened so far is the board has tentatively determined or established draft disclosure guidelines or disclosure principles. Sorry, let me say that differently. Draft disclosure guidance, which would allow the board to improve how it's developing and drafting those disclosures. And what the board will do next is then test that draft guidance against two standards, IAS 19 and IFRS 13. And it'll be sort of an iterative process where in the course of testing the guidance against those two standards, it'll learn from that process and then improve the draft guidance thereafter. So in the course of that, it will also ideally improve the disclosures in IAS 19 and IFRS 13, which would then be issued for the normal public consultation process in addition to the board developing that draft guidance. The third piece is management commentary. So now we're looking at information that's outside the financial statements. And what the board is looking to do here is update the practice statement on management commentary. What it's observed is that over the last several years there have been various developments in the marketplace, and it sort of needs a refresh. One of the things that is most evident is this notion of wider corporate reporting. So there are a number of other things that are being discussed around the world globally that some of which is more public policy matters, which wouldn't necessarily fit within financial reporting, but other elements better describe what's going on in the financial statements and would potentially have a role within management commentary. So these are things like management strategy for long-term value creation, what are the risks associated with those strategies, what are the things that management is focusing on today that might eventually manifest itself in the financial statements. So the board is focusing on providing more disclosure guidance in those areas with the focus on helping the capital market actor. So the scope of the project is still very much focused on our core mission of capital market participants. And then the last piece is the taxonomy, which is focusing on the delivery of all of that financial information. And there's a whole host of information on our website, educational materials for preparers, materials for regulators, as well as just updates that we're doing to the taxonomy that stakeholders could provide comments on.
So that sounds like a lot of activity and effort around effectively communicating better with stakeholders,
Absolutely.
the users of financial statements. So that's a huge push from the IASB at the moment. But if I can turn to one more area just around the project, and that is goodwill and impairment.
Yes.
I know we've been asked about it all of the time.
Yes.
So any comments on the status of that project at the moment?
Absolutely. So that one is proving to be a very tricky area. The project came about from the IFRS 3 post-implementation review. And there were a number of different areas that the board was originally looking to solve, areas with respect to making the impairment test more effective. So right now, there are concerns that the impairment test may be leading to the recognition of impairment too little, too late. in the way that management or users may already know that the acquisition is not performing the way it was originally intended by the time they actually see that impairment charge. The other piece is whether there are opportunities to simplify the impairment test. So the board had explored some ways to try to make the impairment test more effective, and it was interesting in the course of doing that exploration, it became very clear that the test has some challenges in that there's this shielding effect. So you have all this internally recognized goodwill, internally generated goodwill, internally generated intangible assets that basically shield the potential for impairment of goodwill. And as a result of that, when there is goodwill impairment that's recognized, it can be later than maybe what would be ideal for users. There isn't an easy solution to that. So what the board decided a few months ago is to take another look at the objectives. And what they're focusing on are a couple of things. One is trying to identify better disclosures that would help the users understand why management is making the acquisition that it's making, what they hope to achieve with that acquisition, and then subsequent to the acquisition, how is it performing against those original expectations. The other thing that it's still looking to do is simplify the test. So whether there are opportunities to simplify the value and use calculation, taking a look at discount rates, taking a look at future cash flows, as well as determining whether if we decide that it's not possible to make the impairment test more effective, then are there other ways that we can account for goodwill? Because at some point it needs to be taken off the balance sheet. So one possible way is amortizing goodwill. Another way that the test could be simplified would be to have more of an indicator approach to testing for goodwill. So instead of being required to test it every year, look for triggers in the environment that would then result in goodwill impairment testing. So there's still a lot of work to be done. The board is planning to issue a discussion paper. It'll probably be a little bit of time still before we're in a position to actually issue a discussion paper, because there's a number of conversations that still need to be had about what the nature of those disclosures would look like before we would get to that stage.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure there'll be a lot of engagement once it comes
Absolutely.
out, because it's clearly a topical matter. If I can finish off on this note, so it's clear that technology is a driver across sort of many spheres in commerce generally and in business, and accounting and reporting is not immune to that.
Yep.
In fact, it's probably one of the focal areas where technology potentially has a change. And going through your website, I noticed that the foundation has a technology initiative. If you could just share with us very briefly what that initiative is about, what brought it to fruition, and where are you with it?
Yep, sure. What the board is trying to do with the technology initiative is take a look and understand what effect does developments in technology have on us as a standard setter and on financial reporting generally. So we're still in the very early days of taking a look at this, but from the work that we've done so far, we see 4 work streams coming out of this. The first work stream relates to just accounting of technological developments. So the easiest example here is crypto assets. Is there something that needs to be done in this space? Is there something that needs to be done with respect to initial coin offerings? Anything related to the actual standards themselves would fall into this first work stream. The second work stream relates to consumption of financial reporting. So this is a big one where we would consider, or we would take a look at understanding how technology is changing how users are using financial reporting. So we're moving away from a paper-based environment, and when you do that, if you think about questions about the location of disclosures, or questions about, well, if we provide too much disclosure, it won't all fit on this piece of paper. Those types of issues go away. Other things that might be affected is that whether there continues to be a role for structured financial reporting, particularly if you think about artificial intelligence, is that going to do away with all need for structure, or is there still some benefit to structure because that allows for the comparability and more credibility of the information that you're looking at. So if structure continues to make sense, then what role does the IFRS taxonomy play? Presumably it would continue to play a role, and what needs to be done to the IFRS taxonomy so that it remains fit for purpose. So that's the second work stream. The third work stream relates to the standard setting process itself. So this would cover things like using technology to enhance the evidence-based research that we do to support our standard setting, using technology if it's possible to help us improve our internal processes to make them more efficient. So reviewing comment letters, taking a look and summarizing the comment letters that we receive from external parties, anything along those lines, just so that we can do our work and do it more efficiently. And then the fourth work stream relates to stakeholder engagement. So using technology to continue to reach out to and communicate with their stakeholders, understand what's on the minds of stakeholders. So one of the obstacles that we sometimes have is that the world is a big place and it's quite difficult for everybody to physically be present for meetings. So using webcasts, using video conferencing facilities to continue to have those dialogues. Other things that we are looking at are how people access our standards, and to what extent can we use technology to make it easier for people to find things within EIFRS, or just as they research within the IFRS standards. So still early days, as I mentioned, and technology is so rapidly changing that I'm sure as things change, we'll have to continue to update our strategy, but it'll be a fun and exciting time.
Thank you very much, Nili. So certainly never a dull moment for the technical staff at the IASB. Lots of work to be done, and slowly being dragged into the 21st century by technology. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.